This morning's message is called Conversationalists, and we're going to continue in our study in Judges. Lauren's dad. We should dismiss the seekers, too. They was all getting excited that they were going to hear my long message. Sorry to disappoint. You guys have a great time downstairs. Lauren's dad, Bill, was a great conversationalist. I've never been a very good conversationalist, and so it took me a long time to figure out why he was so easy to talk with. And after a few years, I began to actually notice, oh man, well, he asks questions. When he's talking to me, when I've seen him talk to other people, he asks questions. He would actually listen when I was answering the questions, and he would seem interested in what I was saying enough to where he'd offer his own responses, but not in a way that would derail the conversation or take away from what I was saying, just in a way that would just let me know he's listening, he's tracking. And there were times over the years when, I wasn't very chatty. I didn't have anything to say, and he would deliberately, like this is just the way he conversed with people, he would throw out topics. He'd lob them over the plate until I could connect with one of them. And after spending time, and his dad was very similar that way, his brothers are similar too that way, the good conversationalist. Now, have you ever been trapped by a bad conversationalist? It's miserable. Yeah, a bad conversationalist is someone who, they're just talking, and they're making no point at the time. They're probably talking about themselves. Maybe they're talking about someone else. They're certainly not interested in you or your life in that moment. I'm not even sure. When a person is overcome with bad conversationalist vibes, I'm not even sure they're aware that there's someone standing there while they're talking. And they're not good listeners, right? So bad conversationalists, it's the oh, look at the time kind of situation. The kicker is that I don't think it's uncommon, or I should say it's more common, for we as followers of Jesus to actually be bad conversationalists when it comes to our talk with God. We will tend to talk. We will tend to ask. We will tend to give God instructions on how we think he should do X, Y, Z. And if he could just zap our ideas, infuse our ideas with his power, then boy, that would be great. And that characterizes a lot of people's prayer life. And I don't mean that we do it on purpose. But this morning, we're continuing to look into Jephthah's role as a judge. And what I find interesting is that he also is using his words in a way to manipulate the results or outcomes. And I've said from the beginning with Jephthah, I was really just, recall me saying, I've been sitting with this. I've been trying to understand, is Jephthah a good guy? Is he a bad guy? What sort of mix are we looking at? He talks about the Lord a lot. And is he genuine? And just trying to sift through all that. And in the sifting, I believe I've come to a place where I tend to agree with a number of different scholars, not because they're scholars and I'm not, but because when we take the whole bit that's given to us in the book of Judges that has to do with Jephthah, the whole thing, when we take in all the information, there really is a more clear direction on what kind of guy he is. And what kind of guy he seems to be more self-serving and outwardly pious than he is, he just had a rough start and God can use anybody and he's open to it. And so, God uses even the least of these. That's not what the writer appears to be getting at. So we're going to look at this morning. I'm going to give you two examples, right? Two recalls of the ways Jephthah used his words, all right? One, you recall when the elders of Gilead were looking for someone to fight against the Ammonites who were poised to attack and take their land from them. They couldn't find anybody, so they go to him. Now, they were going to offer him the lesser of a role. We just need you to be in charge of the military stuff. But he talks to them, he negotiates, and he comes out on top being both basically the chieftain of the tribe and the top military commander. So with his words, he's able to persuade them that way. The next thing we see him do that the narrator is doing in chapter 11 is trying to assuage the king of Ammon from attacking. And if you recall, Ammon says, oh, by the way, this is our land way back, and we want it now. And so he presented, and we looked at it, a really good argument as to why, no, that's not a legitimate claim, and your request is hereby denied, in so much. So he communicates a solid argument. He uses his words to do that. Ironically, the king of Ammon, he's like a bad listener. It says he didn't listen to anything Jephthah had to say. So much for all the work he put into that message. So this third time, we're going to see that Jephthah relies on his words for this other thing that he wants. And again, it's self-serving, but what he wants is victory. So we're going to pray here. I'll ask you to join me in prayer, and then we'll get into some of this and hopefully have some encouraging stuff as we finish up. Our Father in heaven, I just wanted to thank you for this morning. I thank you for the folks that are here, and for the folks that are watching. And we thank you for the time that we have. God, thank you so much that you provided rain for the land outside. And you don't have to be a professional farmer to know that we needed rain. And so we're so grateful for that. And so let it be, let it be. We're also grateful for this building that's dry and air conditioned. And just a reminder of these little silly blessings. Well, the rain's not silly, but the air conditioning maybe. We're just grateful for your blessing. Thank you. Father, I just wanted to ask that you would continue to move and guide throughout the course of this morning and use your word to draw us into a place where we're more deeply aligned with you, that we come to understand how we interact with you better. I pray that you would bless the folks who are listening. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. We're going to look now in Judges chapter 11. We're looking at verses 29 through 40. And we talked about, just a moment ago, I said that there's a third thing that Jephthah wants. He's going to use his words to try to get, and that's a victory. So, beginning in verse 29, it says, Then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. Now that would be a cue normally in the other parts of the book of Judges, like, oh, here we go. This legitimizes his being a judge. And in fact, he's considered a judge as far as the narrator is concerned. And God does work through him to rescue Israel from their situation. However, it's not because I'm going to put this up front because I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this facet. But we're going to see that the Lord does use Jephthah to accomplish accomplish getting Israel out from under the thumb of the Ammonites. So God does do that. He does rescue them. But we're going to see, I think you'll see with me, that it isn't really because Jephthah is on the right page with God at all. It's just there's almost two separate things going on. There's what God's doing because he's merciful and slow to anger and compassionate. And then there's what Jephthah's up to. And they're really not the same thing. They sort of cross, but two different agendas. We're going to look at Jephthah's agenda going forward. So the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead. And from Mizpah of Gilead, he passed on to the Ammonites. So what he's done here, he's gone through these towns and he's collected men. That's what's happening. He's collected men. Verse 30, And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. And he struck them from Aroer to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities, and as far as Abel Keramim with a great blow. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. So in the front of it, if we're taking it from we're reading a story, and this is what it is. It's a story of what has happened, and the narrators put the details in a certain order for us to track along. It's actually really exciting. It says, look, here's what's happened. The Spirit of the Lord has come upon him. Jephthah goes out, he gathers men, and he makes this vow. If you're going to give me the victory over the Ammonites, then I'm going to give you whatever walks out of my house as a burnt offering. And in some ways, on the face of it, especially as people being so far removed in time and culture, it doesn't really seem bad. Like, okay, so how many of you know where this is going? Let's see a show of hands. You know who walks out of his house. But if you didn't know that, and you're just looking at this as a story, it's intriguing. You're like, okay, this all seems to be going in a good direction. And not so much. This third use of Jephthah's words, his conversation with God, which it turns out, while God did work, like I said, it becomes, so God, the Lord saved, but these words are the very thing that actually lead to his ruin, his destruction. So through his words, the Lord saves Israel from their predicament, but then at the same time it has a ruinous effect, and we're going to unfold that. So before we get too far into that, it would really help if we had a better understanding of why Jephthah's vow is inherently flawed, right? We were already beating around the bush about it. There's something weird about what he's saying, why he's saying it, and how the whole thing unfolds for those of you who have read forward. You know that something's amiss, and I would like to just shine a little bit of light on how we can know that things are goofy. The narrator knows they're goofy, and he's giving us clues. The people to whom first would have read this, they would have understood the clues. They would have understood the law. They would have understood why Jephthah's vow was less than. They would have heard the story. So let's, for our sake, take a peek. A vow, first off, is defined generally. It appears in the Old Testament as a conditional promise in the form of an if-then clause, right? Just like we saw here. Lord, if you do X, Y, Z, then I will do PDQ in return, And in this case, he says, if you give me the victory, then I'm going to get whatever comes out of my house, I'll offer as a burnt offering. I will say, just for the back of your knowledge, in the scriptures and in the ancient Near East culture, there are vows and there are oaths. And the reason I'm mentioning that right now is because later we're going to look at something that Jesus said, and there's a connection between vows and oaths and how we talk to God and how we talk to one another. And so I'm just going to put that little seed thought in there for you. But vows are these conditional promises that get made. Now, when it comes to vows, I'd like to invite you to look at Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 through 23 with me. Briefly, here it says, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you, did I read that correctly? You shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. Next part explains it better. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. And so the situation here is like whenever you make a vow, God takes that very seriously. And so to make it, and Moses is saying to make it and then sort of forget to fulfill it, puts you in a spot where you're committing sin, and God doesn't take that lightly. Better to just keep your mouth shut and not vow at all. It's okay because it's completely volitional. It's voluntary. You didn't have to make a vow to the Lord. That's something that you do. You chose to do it. God didn't demand anybody make a vow. And so he's saying be very, very careful with it. You could find yourself in an awkward spot. In the Old Testament, there are three different types of vows that are recorded. One or more are vows for a safe return from a journey. Others are requests for more family. You see that with Hannah, the mother of Samuel. And the other one here, a military victory. It's the only one that I'm aware of in terms of a vow made directly to God for a military victory. So the payment of these vows, right, here's just a little information, just understanding vows. That's all we're doing right now. The payment of vows could be made through a burnt offering. And these are all listed in Leviticus, Numbers, and Samuel. If you want to know where, you can get with me later, but just moving quickly for now, payment of vows can be made through a burnt offering, through a monetary gift, or an item or a person requested of God, then given back to him as fulfillment of the vow. Again, you look at Samuel was prayed for. His mom couldn't have children. She prayed, God gave, and Samuel, she had said, you give me a child, I will give him to you. And so she takes him at a very young age and places him with the high priest. And Samuel is raised there around all the priestly culture. And he becomes a great prophet. But he is given to the Lord to use. Now, he's not given as a burnt offering. He's given, the vow is to give him over to the service of the Lord. So there's different. Later, in a few weeks, we're going to be looking at Samson, and that's another type of vow, by the way, a Nazirite vow, and we'll look more at that later. We won't spend a lot of time on it this morning. I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. Praise and thanksgiving are another way in which people can pay their vows to God, through praise and thanksgiving. But because vows in the Scripture are so beautiful, when done with sincerity and fulfilled, there's also some built-in safeguards, because we are, amidst our human people, are a passionate people. There's some that are more passionate than others. And sometimes we'll speak out of turn. Sometimes we'll speak out of how we feel, or out of excitement, or maybe even anger. And so in the Mosaic Law, there's actually some safeguards built in. And just one example of those is that in Numbers chapter 30, we find that there are safeguards for a young woman if she was to make a rash vow. Here we go. So a young woman's father or a married woman's husband could annul her vow. Now, this all you women's rights, minded folk, we've been really clear from the look at Tina leaning in now. She's like, "What you gonna say?" We've been really clear from up here. This isn't about who has more or less value. God created man and woman to have an equal amount of value. He loves them both, but he's given us different roles. And in the fulfillment of those roles, particularly in this Hebrew culture, thousands of years ago, the head of household had the authority to annul a vow if it was made rashly. So that's something to know, that God's already, and we're going to look at something else in a few minutes. So to know that God's so serious about the vow that just because somebody speaks it in a hasty way, for good or for bad or whatever, he's aware of our inclinations and kind of told Moses, here's a few safeguards to prevent people from getting themselves into bigger trouble than need to be, right? So we just see an example of that there. So I share that to say this. When Jephthah's vow is compared and contrasted with the ancient Near East, so there are historical documents available that have vows made in the other Semitic cultures. They make vows, they've documented them and stuff like that. When we compare those vows with the vows, or the way vows are to be made in the Scriptures, the Old Testament Scriptures, and then we take Jephthah's vow and we say, well, let's see what he said and see how it pans out and what he did with them. And we compare and contrast the three groups: Jephthah's, the ancient Near East cultures, and the Old Testament Hebrew culture. Jephthah's vow and the execution of it, no pun intended, look much more like a Canaanite vow than they do a Hebrew vow. And that's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising. What we've seen in the book of Judges so far is that the people of God, the Israelites, are continuing to take on the characteristics of the Canaanite people around them, right? Yeah, let me see a nod of the head here, because you're all good listeners. Like they're taking on their attributes and their characteristics, their worship. And you'll also recall, again, nodding of heads, that no, they weren't supposed to do that. They were supposed to be free from that. In fact, they were supposed to be inviting the foreign nations, all who would believe in Yahweh, the Lord, they were to invite them into a place of Yahwehism, so to speak, of worshiping the one true God. So we know already the thing's it's flipped upside down, and so that Jephthah, that he is acting more like a Canaanite than an Israelite, isn't a surprise, but it's important. It's important for us to realize that. So let's go back and let's look at Judges. We're in chapter 11 again. Let's look at verses 34. Look, verse 34. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah. And behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. Boy, that's interesting. I mean, just again, if you get into like how things are written, how this is written, think about how the writer is putting this. She was his only child. And he goes on to make it even more clear. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. He's just saying, I want you to be clear that this guy had one heir, one daughter. That's it. He didn't have other wives with other daughters that we're talking about here or other sons. It's one. Verse 35, and as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. Ooh. So this is awkward, right? He wins the battle. He's made the vow. And the first person out who comes out of his house is his daughter. And it's an exciting, it's a beautiful, it's an innocent picture of this young girl. I don't know how young, but somewhere, I'd say maybe early teens to later teens. And she's dancing and she's happy for her father who's won the victory. And she knows the Lord has done this for him. She is acknowledging who the true victor is. And his response is, look what you have done to me. Look what you have done. Look what you have caused. Like, hold up. Like, if you're paying attention, the man wasn't saying, look what I've done. Look at the calamity that I've caused with a rash vow. It's a clue as to what kind of guy Jephthah was. He puts it on her, lays the blame on her. He doesn't take responsibility for it himself. You have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble for me. And he talks about the vow. So he says, I cannot take back my vow. Actually, yes, you can. Turns out you can. And if he had known God, if he had known the Mosaic law, the ways in which God had shared with Israel about how to live the life that he wanted to share with them, if he'd have known, if he'd have taken the time to truly know the Lord, he would have known the following: that they had a system of valuation for redeeming people who were offered to the Lord. Leviticus 27, there are 8 verses. This is going to be so much fun because some of you are going to pick up on something that we're not talking about this morning. We can talk about it in the afters. We'll have a blast. It'll be a hoot. But for our purpose, I just want you to listen to what exists in the law about people who are vowed to the Lord. Chapter 27, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, If anyone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuations of persons, then the valuation of a male from 20 years old up to 60 years old shall be 50 shekels of silver according to the shekel of the sanctuary. If the person is a female, the valuation shall be 30 shekels. If the person is from 5 years old up to 20 years old, the valuation shall be for a male 20 shekels and for a female 10 shekels. If the person is from a month old up to 5 years old, the valuation shall be for a male 5 shekels of silver, and for a female the valuation shall be 3 shekels of silver. And if the person is 60 years old or over, then the valuation for a male shall be 15 shekels, and for a female 10 shekels. And if someone is too poor to pay the valuation, then he shall be made to stand before the priest, and the priest shall value him. The priest shall value him according to what the vower can afford. So if somebody says, I want to make a vow, I vow, the life of so-and-so, and for some reason, the life of so-and-so is integral to their survival and their family system, there's a way in which that person can be redeemed monetarily. they can be paid for, and the vow kept by giving money, and the person redeemed from having to fulfill whatever the terms of the vow were. That's in the law. This, like, God allowed for this, and he's pretty clear. He did ages, he did genders, and he even did it economically. He's like, if somebody's too poor, have the priest make an evaluation that they can afford. My question is, if Jephthah was really a man of God, why didn't he know this? If Jephthah really cared, and his daughter comes out of the house and he had vowed to give whatever had come out of the house first, isn't it reasonable, based on the Mosaic law, based on the Old Testament, based on the law they had, isn't it reasonable to think, to see that there's an easy solution to this? That he could go to the priest and there could be a valuation made of his daughter, and rather than sacrifice her life, he could pay the money. But no, he's made a vow. Whatever comes out of my house, I can't take it back. I can't take it back. He couldn't take it back because he didn't know any better. He couldn't take it back because he didn't really know Yahweh. He couldn't take it back. He didn't know how to approach or talk to the Lord. You see, so this whole thing could have been avoided, but it's not avoided. It gets into this hairy mess that we're about to see, and it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable here in the 21st century. It was uncomfortable then. Verse 36, back in Judges chapter 11, verse 36, let's look at what it says. And she said to him, "My father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites." Wow. I mean, this girl, for whatever kind of man Jephthah was to everybody else, however he treated or saw her, her love for him is portrayed as being really top-notch. Verse 37, so she said to her father, "Let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions." So he said, "Go." Then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of the 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. That is a difficult ending to this particular account. It is difficult. It has bothered people down through thousands of years. People have tried to reconcile what this says with who God is and how we should be with and to and for God. Like, they're trying to put this together. I read a really, I say compelling. It's not compelling, but there are some scholars who put together an argument, and they go through what seems like every possible loophole, word, understanding of this word or that, or what's burnt offering, or every loophole. They try to work through everything, and they discuss it at length. Could it be that this is that, or this means this, and that never did this? And the whole thing is just trying to wrap their heads around how this can't be so. How Yahweh, God, the Lord, would never accept a human sacrifice, right? And yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. He never would. He never did, except for one. So something is up with Jephthah. He is talking throughout the account, throughout the narrative, like he knows the Lord. He gets his position, and they make a covenant before the Lord. He makes a vow to the Lord and wants the victory and all these types of things. But he doesn't seem to know who he's talking to. He doesn't seem to know the things that God had already revealed. And I have to believe that that's his choice. And it's just an example of how far off the people had gotten from following God. When I was reading the arguments for why or in what ways this particular, like how scholars are trying to reconcile, like this didn't happen. He didn't actually like present her as a burnt offering, right? He didn't actually do that because the language is like, it gives us just enough to think that there's a loophole or there's a way out. But even in their arguments, they would repeatedly say, they give an argument for, okay, here's sort of a loophole, and they say, but that's not likely. And here's an argument as possible loophole, but that's not likely. And it just went on like that. It was just like super long and super detailed. And in the end, they were like, but, so she probably, this is their ending, was she probably lived a life, never married and never had family. After their whole thing was like, that's not likely, it's not likely, it's not likely, because he said, I will present that person as a burnt offering, and then it says he performed the vow. Now, the sticking point for skeptics is that what kind of God does that? I feel like I have a lot to say about that because all the gods that were being worshipped around them were doing just that. And there's all sorts of archaeological evidence, historical documents, a ton, actually quite a bit even in the Bible, affirming that this was done by the other cultures. So it happens. It happens still today. I don't want to get too lost in this, but abortion, it's sacrificing another person's life for the convenience of the one. And I'm not trying to bag on anybody who's done it. I'm just saying, let's call it what it is. We still sacrifice children. And that's not good. God never wanted that. Anyway, not to polarize, let's come on back then to the presenting issue. In regard to that, Leviticus 18:21, in case you have any questions about what did God actually say about sacrificing children, Leviticus 18:21 reads this way. It says, you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. There's a little bit of work that can be done there, but I can summarize it for you. To offer them to Molech, Molech is a lesser god, a foreign god, a deity, and they all sort of combine. He's related to Baal, and to offer them to, the phrase actually means they pass through. And if you keep reading about this practice, it's to pass through the fire. In fact, it becomes a very significant thread in which Jesus picks up on. Okay, I gotta rein myself in. But anyway, God abhors it. In the same way, I'm sure he abhors abortion, but God never told anyone, God never wanted anyone to sacrifice their child. You say, what about Isaac? That's a whole other conversation, but Isaac didn't get sacrificed, did he? God provided. And so there's that backdrop against which Jephthah operates in contrast to the way that the Lord had told his people to operate. And so we see that. So Jephthah remains ignorant of God's word. He doesn't know it, doesn't want to know it, and so he treats Yahweh, he treats the Lord in the same way that these other people groups treat their gods. And that's the big no-no. That's the big problem all along with the people here in the time of the judges. And so ultimately, Jephthah's vow is self-centered. It's a self-centered arrangement that gives to get. Like in the beginning, he said, I vow to give you whatever comes out of my house first, on the condition of you do what? You give me the victory. So I'm giving to get. And I think that's important. That gives us a jumping off point about our own personal lives. I'll say this. I've got to move ahead kind of quickly, but if we think about Gideon and Abimelech and Jephthah and we kind of put these major judges together, which the narrator has given us here in these last few chapters. They show variations of the same sin-driven proclivity that prioritizes their own desire above God's desire. So here the slide will say something like, they prioritize their own good above God's good and above the good of those around them. That's the repeating problem. That's the bad cycle. And so as far as the book of Judges goes, they're still a people, the tribes of Israel are still a people that aren't unified. They still need a king. They can't find anybody worthy. All who are risen, or who rise up to do it, generally do it with self-centered ambition and so on. And they're waiting. They need a good king. And humans aren't inherently good, and so we don't make inherently good kings. Getting back to the vow then, vows and oaths, this does affect us in the New Testament world. Jesus, you remember from the Sermon on the Mount, or more like the teaching on the hillside, he spoke about giving an oath. Matthew chapter 5, verse 34 through 37. And here's where I kind of want to just try to bring this in a little closer to where you and I live, and some good things about how we relate to God. But Matthew chapter 5, you'll recall, it says, "But I say to you, do not take an oath at all." With the word oath, we're getting into some similar territory. He says, don't do it at all. "Either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." And so Jesus is talking about what it's like to live in the kingdom. This is a conversation that comes smack dab in the Sermon on the Mount when he's saying kingdom life, the kingdom of heaven looks like this, and how you live in it looks like this. And this is one of the things he says, this is what it looks like. And he's saying someone whose heart has been transformed to be, or to share in God's heart, is going to produce words that reflect their integrity. There's no need to make a vow of something greater than themselves. It just says, become the kind of people who, when you say something, people believe it. And that if you're going to make a commitment, that you keep the commitment. That's the kind of people, that's how it works. It comes out of a deep place, a place of goodness, and that place of goodness has to be transformed from our own selfishness into God's goodness. So he does this work. He said, and then it's from the inside, a place of integrity and a place of goodness, the goodness of God, that we say things and we're able to keep those commitments. We don't just say things to get something. We don't just do things to get something. There's a change that goes on inside. So thus, again, moving ahead a little quickly, he says, I want to share this, that God's life is shared with each of his citizens. We're talking about, in Matthew, he's talking about the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And he's saying that God shares his life, and then it enables them to speak and act in ways that are consistent with his life. Right? Jephthah was detached from his life, and so it didn't matter what his speech said, his actions were detached from the way God expected him, wanted him to live. And so we come to this now about our own lives. When we talk to God, what's it like? What does it look like for you when you pray, when you have a conversation with God? What kind of conversationalist are you? What kind of conversationalist am I when I talk to God, when I pray? I have two questions for us to consider this morning. When you talk to God, are you attempting to give in order to get? Let me put a little meat on those bones. There was a time when I would become anxious about not reading the Bible because I was concerned that it upset God. By not reading, like every day, don't be distracted too much, the worship team's coming up, you'll be fine. I was concerned that if I wasn't reading my Bible every day, that God was, disappointed. Am I the only one? You don't have to answer out loud, but am I the only one? You do or you don't do certain things and you think that God's, he probably wanted more from me. But for a long time, I approached reading the Bible in such a way that, as long as I did my part, right? Then God would do for me what I thought he would do, which would he'd make my life better. He'd show me how to be a better Christian or whatever. It's not that it's untrue, but that I would think that God was disappointed if I didn't became my attempt to give in order to get. So now I began to read the Bible in order to get God's whatever he wanted, a better life. That's not why we read, that's not why we come to him. We shouldn't come to give to get. Now, only you can answer the question for yourself. Do I come in some way? Do I talk to God? Do I converse with him in some way that I am just expecting something because I've come, because I've done my part, now God must do his part? If I would spend time in prayer for X amount of time during the day or the week, or if I would read my Bible for so long each day, then God will preserve me from bad circumstances. You know, like some of we kind of come into it that way, and bad circumstances are all part of the gig. No one gets out of here unscathed. We live in a broken world. We're broken people, and so we have to be careful about coming to God in order to get something. So are you attempting to give in order to get? The second question is, are you leaving space for God to talk to you? We come to God, and he wants us to come to him. He does. Listen. But do we take advantage of that? You know, do we just come and we talk to him? We talk at him. We say, here, God, here's what my day is like. Here's where I've fallen short. Here's what I'd really like to see happen. Oh, and by the way, and there's this thing that I wouldn't mind having. See, we talk to him. We talk at him. Like that's a bad conversation. That's not even really a conversation. I think for a conversation, there has to be a transmission and reception. Boop, boop. Somebody's listening, somebody's talking, and then the roles reverse, and there's fellowship, there's relationship. So the question is, do we listen well enough for him to shape our thoughts, stir our hearts, and introduce his desires into the realm of our naturally polluted place? Like, are we listening long enough and intently enough to have our mess replaced by his goodness? That takes some listening. Jephthah didn't do that. Jephthah didn't have his internals transformed. Jephthah didn't listen to what God said he required and how it is he's relate to him. Jephthah dismissed all of that. And the question is, do we tend to dismiss the way we approach God? Are we listening? What a the great thing about a message like this is that the next step, it's not like anybody should be leaving like, oh man, I haven't been reading my Bible. I haven't been talking to God. Like that's not this message. This message is you have the opportunity to listen to God. He is a great conversationalist. He knows when you need to talk, but he also wants you to listen to him too. He's a great conversationalist. He wants you to listen to him as much as he listens to you. So I want to encourage you to think on these things in the coming week. We're going to sing. I'll invite you to stand as Pastor Noah gets ready to lead us. I'm still inviting you to stand as Pastor Noah gets ready to lead us. But God is a great conversationalist. He'll listen to you, and he wants you to listen to him too. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us through our webpage, bbcoxford.com. We'd love to be able to help you as best we can.